Have you ever considered that the story of African American ancestry might be more intricate than you've been led to believe? Beneath the surface lies a hidden legacy, one that interweaves the histories of African, Native American, and European peoples in ways far more intricate and profound than the mainstream narrative acknowledges. This is a tale of erased identities, overlooked tribes, and a rediscovery that could redefine how we see ourselves and each other. Are you ready to dive into this untold history? For too long, the ancestry of African Americans has been framed solely as a direct lineage from the millions of enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. While this narrative is central and undeniably true, it is far from the full picture. Beneath the surface, a more intricate web of connections emerges, one that challenges and reshapes the conventional understanding of African American heritage. At the heart of this complexity lies the often overlooked connection to Native American ancestry. Historical evidence and oral traditions paint a vivid picture of shared histories, alliances, and cultural exchanges that span centuries. For example, the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole tribes formed deep bonds with African Americans, providing refuge to those escaping enslavement. The descendants of these alliances carry not just shared bloodlines, but the resilience and survival strategies of two deeply oppressed peoples. This hidden legacy reveals a story of survival against all odds. Native Americans and Africans, both displaced and marginalized, found common ground and forged new identities through shared struggles. Yet these connections have often been deliberately erased, overshadowed by colonial records and societal norms that sought to simplify and homogenize identities into rigid racial categories. Now, thanks to advancements in genetic testing and a renewed interest in ancestry, this forgotten chapter is coming to light. With every discovery, we are reminded that history is far more nuanced than it seems, and that understanding our interconnected roots is key to transforming how we view heritage and identity today. For Native Americans, this rediscovery is not just an academic pursuit, but a call to reclaim and celebrate the deep bonds that have long been hidden in plain sight. Historical records and cutting-edge genetic research reveal a profound truth about African American ancestry. It is far more diverse than commonly understood. While African heritage predominates at an average of 73.2%, genetic studies show that approximately 24% of African American ancestry traces back to Europe, and about 2% originates from Native American communities. These percentages, though seemingly small, conceal a deeply rooted and complex history of shared lives, cultures, and struggles. But statistics alone cannot capture the depth of these connections. For many families, ties to Native American ancestry go beyond numbers. They are reflected in generations of intermarriage, shared traditions, and cultural blending that created uniquely layered identities. How did this rich heritage become so obscured? To uncover the answer, we must revisit the long history of colonization, slavery, and systemic erasure that reshaped identities in America. From the earliest colonial periods, policies and practices sought to simplify racial categories, erasing indigenous heritage along the way. People of mixed African and Native ancestry were often labeled as colored or black, stripping them of their native roots. This misclassification was not accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to erase indigenous identities, consolidating power and control under rigid racial hierarchies. Government records, census data, and societal norms all played a role, systematically eroding recognition of Native American ancestry. For example, colonial census records often categorized individuals with Native American heritage as black, based solely on physical appearance or presumed African lineage. This deliberate erasure ignored family histories, tribal affiliations, and cultural practices, reducing complex identities to a single racial label. By the 19th century, countless African Americans with Native ancestry had lost formal recognition of their ties to indigenous communities, their stories preserved only in whispered family traditions. Yet this heritage remains resilient. Hidden within family narratives, cultural practices, and even genetic data, these stories are being rediscovered today. The legacy of these intertwined ancestries challenges simplistic narratives and reminds us of the enduring connections between Native American and African American communities. It is a testament to the resilience of both peoples who, despite centuries of oppression, maintained fragments of their identities and histories for future generations to reclaim. One of the most enduring myths in American history is the belief that African Americans and Native Americans lived as entirely separate communities, with little overlap in their experiences or histories. In reality, their stories are deeply intertwined, woven together by centuries of shared survival, resistance, and oppression during the era of European colonization. This connection is not merely a story of loss, but one of resilience, adaptation, and enduring cultural legacies. It challenges long-held assumptions about identity and heritage. Many African Americans, for instance, grew up hearing family tales of Indian blood or ancestors who belonged to specific tribes such as the Cherokee, Creek, or Seminole. For generations, these stories were often dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. However, modern research, both genetic and historical, increasingly validates these oral histories, shedding light on how African and Native ancestries became intertwined. This blending of identities was not always a choice. During the brutal realities of colonization and slavery in the 17th and 18th centuries, enslaved Africans and Native Americans often formed alliances out of necessity. Native communities faced catastrophic losses from war, disease, and the Indian slave trade, which saw thousands of indigenous people forcibly removed from their lands and sold into slavery. Simultaneously, African slaves were brought to the Americas in increasing numbers, and the two groups frequently found themselves in the same spaces, on plantations, in frontier settlements, or in remote wilderness refuges where they sought to escape their oppressors. For example, during the Indian slave trade, tribes such as the Yamasee and Appalachee were targeted by European colonists and sold into slavery in the Caribbean and Europe. Those who escaped often formed alliances with African slaves, leading to the creation of blended communities. One notable example is the Black Seminoles, descendants of escaped African slaves, who found refuge among the Seminole people in Florida. Together they forged a unique cultural and military bond, resisting colonization and slavery with remarkable resilience. These alliances were not only about survival, they were also acts of defiance against the oppressive colonial system. By sharing their knowledge, customs, and survival strategies, African and Native peoples created rich, hybrid identities that carried forward the legacies of both groups. Today, their descendants stand as living proof of these connections, challenging the simplistic narratives of separation and reminding us of the strength found in unity. Despite the deep connections between African American and Native American communities, colonial authorities actively suppressed the recognition of Native ancestry within African American populations. Policies were intentionally designed to define identity based solely on skin color or presumed African descent. These measures effectively erased the complex histories of individuals with mixed heritage, reducing their identities to a single racial category. By the 19th century, countless African Americans with Native ancestry had lost formal recognition of their ties to indigenous tribes, their connections buried under layers of systemic erasure. Yet, these stories were not entirely extinguished. They endured through whispered family traditions, oral histories, and cultural practices that hinted at deeper roots. For example, African Americans in the Southeast often passed down tales of ancestors from tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, or Choctaw, stories that spoke to a time when their families were part of a larger, interconnected heritage. Today, thanks to advancements in genetic testing and historical research, many African Americans are rediscovering these ancestral ties and reclaiming a part of their heritage that was nearly lost. This process of rediscovery goes far beyond academic inquiry. It is an act of self-definition and historical justice. It demands that we confront the uncomfortable truths of how colonial systems erased Native identities and imposed rigid racial hierarchies. By peeling back the layers of this hidden narrative, we gain a fuller understanding of what it means to be African American and, by extension, to honor the resilience of Native American heritage interwoven with their story. The history of African Americans is often told as one of forced migration and enslavement, but this rediscovery reveals another dimension, a story of survival, interconnection, and the blending of diverse cultures. These ancestors, whether navigating the brutal conditions of colonization or finding solidarity in shared struggles, carried forward legacies of strength and adaptation. Their resilience allowed fragments of their identities to survive, even in the face of systemic efforts to erase them. Today, as African Americans uncover and reclaim their native heritage, we are reminded of the power of shared histories to transform how we see ourselves. This journey is about more than ancestry. It is about celebrating the connections that bind communities together and honoring the legacies of those who carried these stories forward. Could this hidden history reshape how we view African American and Native American identities? Absolutely. By acknowledging this complexity, we can move toward a deeper, more inclusive understanding of our shared past and its implications for the future. What if history as we know it has overlooked an essential chapter? Long before the transatlantic slave trade or the arrival of European settlers, the Americas were home to thriving indigenous societies, each with unique languages, cultures, and traditions. Among these were the native Black Indians, indigenous people with darker skin tones whose stories are often missing from conventional narratives. These communities were a vibrant part of North America's pre-colonial mosaic, yet their identities were obscured as colonization reshaped the land and its people. What happened to these native Black Indians? The answer lies in a devastating combination of systemic erasure, enslavement, and forced assimilation. When European settlers arrived, they encountered diverse indigenous populations, including those with darker skin tones, which led to widespread misclassification. Many native Black Indians were falsely categorized as African or African descended, erasing their distinct indigenous heritage. As colonization expanded, the enslavement of indigenous peoples became a brutal practice. During the 16th and 17th centuries, millions of Native Americans were captured and sold into slavery, often shipped to the Caribbean, Europe, and even Africa. This Indian slave trade decimated entire communities and erased cultural identities as captives were severed from their homelands. Tragically, when enslaved Native Americans returned to the Americas, they were frequently labeled as African slaves, their true origins buried under colonial bureaucracy and systemic racism. This parallel history of indigenous enslavement has often been overshadowed by the transatlantic slave trade, yet its impact was immense. In colonies like the Carolinas and New England, thousands of Native Americans were enslaved, their labor fueling the colonial economy. Unlike African slaves, many indigenous captives were exiled to distant lands, making it nearly impossible for them to maintain connections to their communities. Over time, Native Black Indians found themselves in a cultural liminal space. Some were absorbed into African American communities, forging bonds of survival and shared oppression with African slaves. Others retained their indigenous roots, preserving traditions and oral histories that defied colonial attempts to erase them. Colonial authorities exacerbated this erasure by simplifying racial classifications, categorizing individuals of mixed African and Native descent as colored or black in census records and legal documents. By the 19th century, Native Black Indians had largely vanished from official narratives, their identities reduced to whispers in family stories or misrepresented in historical accounts. Despite these efforts at erasure, the resilience of Native Black Indian heritage remains. Families in regions like the southeastern United States have kept their connections alive through storytelling, spiritual practices, and cultural traditions. Tribes such as the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole maintained long-standing ties to African American communities, with the Seminole Nation being a powerful example of solidarity. The Black Seminoles, descendants of African slaves who sought refuge among the Seminoles in Florida, formed unique cultural and military alliances. Together, they resisted colonization, creating a legacy of resilience that is still celebrated today. Modern advancements in genetic testing and historical research are now confirming what many African American families have known for generations. Their roots extend beyond Africa, interweaving with the rich heritage of Native America. This rediscovery is more than a historical revelation. It is a vital act of reclaiming identities and honoring the adaptability and strength of those who came before us. By shedding light on the history of Native Black Indians, we gain a fuller understanding of America's past. It is a story of survival, defiance, and cultural blending that challenges simplistic narratives and celebrates the resilience of people who refused to let their identities be erased. Reclaiming this history is not just about understanding the past. It's about ensuring that the voices of these communities are heard and honored as an integral part of our collective story. This forgotten chapter in history stands as a powerful testament to the enduring strength of heritage and the resilience of the human spirit in overcoming even the most brutal circumstances. The Indian slave trade, one of the most devastating yet overlooked aspects of colonial history, reshaped the demographic and cultural fabric of North America between the 17th and 18th centuries. While the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas, historical evidence reveals a startling fact. During certain periods, more Native Americans were exported as slaves than Africans were imported. This tragic and systematic practice decimated indigenous populations and laid the foundation for the racial hierarchies that continue to shape society today. Colonial powers, including the British, French, and Spanish, relied heavily on the enslavement of native peoples to build their new territories, exploiting both their labor and their knowledge of the land. Tribes such as the Pequot, Yamasee, and Appalachee were among the earliest victims of large-scale enslavement. Thousands were forcibly taken and sent to labor on sugar plantations in the Caribbean or to serve as domestic workers in Europe. Major colonial ports like Boston, Charleston, and New Orleans became hubs for this human trafficking, facilitating the export of staggering numbers of indigenous captives. What made Native Americans particularly vulnerable to enslavement was their deep familiarity with the land. European settlers saw them not only as a source of labor, but also as a strategic threat to their expansionist ambitions. Entire tribes were targeted during colonial wars, with survivors enslaved and their lands seized. For example, the Yamasee War 1750-1717, a devastating conflict between southeastern tribes and European settlers, resulted in the enslavement and displacement of thousands of Yamasee people. Many of these captives were sold to plantations in the West Indies, where the grueling conditions led to high mortality rates and a further erosion of cultural identity. The Indian slave trade inflicted damage beyond the physical removal of individuals. It shattered tribal social structures, fostering division and distrust among indigenous groups. Colonial powers often incentivized tribes such as the Chickasaw and Creek to act as intermediaries, capturing rival tribes to supply slaves for European traders. This practice not only decimated entire communities, but also sowed seeds of division that persisted long after the trade ended. As the African slave trade grew in scale and profitability, the enslavement of Native Americans began to decline. However, the effects of this horrific trade were far-reaching. Many indigenous survivors of enslavement were reclassified by colonial authorities, with those who intermarried with Africans often stripped of their native identity and labeled as Negro or colored in official records. This bureaucratic erasure compounded the loss of cultural heritage, leaving descendants disconnected from their ancestral roots. Today, the legacy of the Indian slave trade is still evident. Shared histories of oppression and resilience have forged deep connections between African American and Native American communities. Genetic studies and oral histories reveal that a significant portion of African Americans carry indigenous DNA, underscoring the intertwined fates of these communities. Uncovering this hidden history is not merely an academic pursuit. It is essential for understanding the complexities of the past and fostering connections between African American and Native American communities. By acknowledging shared experiences of slavery, survival, and adaptation, we honor the memory of those who endured and recognize the intricate tapestry of American ancestry. As the Indian slave trade declined and the transatlantic importation of African slaves expanded, a new dynamic began to emerge. Native Americans and Africans, forced to coexist under brutal conditions, formed alliances, shared knowledge, and blended cultures, creating legacies of resilience and resistance that continue to inspire us today. This rediscovery reminds us that history is not a collection of isolated events, but a deeply interconnected story of survival, adaptation, and shared humanity. On plantations and in frontier settlements, Native Americans and Africans, often forced into labor together, formed bonds that transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries. These interactions were not merely incidental, they were born out of shared struggles and a profound need for solidarity in the face of brutal oppression by colonial powers. This blending of communities gave rise to a significant population of mixed heritage individuals whose identities defied the rigid racial classifications imposed by colonial societies. The process of cultural fusion between Native Americans and Africans was deeply rooted in resilience. Both groups faced systemic exploitation, forced displacement from their lands, and the erasure of their cultural identities. Yet, in these adversities, they found strength in unity, sharing knowledge, customs, and survival strategies to navigate a hostile colonial environment. Intermarriage between African slaves and Native Americans was particularly common in regions like the Southeast. Tribes such as the Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee often offered refuge to escaped African slaves, incorporating them into their communities. These alliances were transformative, not only providing mutual support, but also creating a legacy of dual heritage that wove African traditions into Native customs. For instance, the Black Seminoles, descendants of these unions, became a symbol of resistance and adaptation, forging a unique identity that blended the best of both worlds. However, colonial authorities viewed these cross-cultural connections as a threat to the racial hierarchies that underpin their economic and political systems. To suppress them, laws were enacted to classify all individuals with African ancestry as Black, regardless of their Native or European roots. The infamous one-drop rule exemplified this effort, asserting that even minimal African ancestry negated any claim to Native or European identity. This bureaucratic erasure not only stripped mixed heritage individuals of their multifaceted identities, but also disconnected them from their indigenous roots. Over time, these policies had devastating consequences. Many African Americans with Native ancestry were severed from tribal affiliations, losing access to languages, traditions, and cultural practices. Simultaneously, Native communities faced increasing pressure to conform to European definitions of Indianness to maintain their legal status as tribes, further marginalizing those with African lineage. These systemic efforts left generations unaware of their rich dual heritage. Despite these challenges, the legacy of mixed heritage endured, manifesting subtly but powerfully in folklore, cuisine, spirituality, and music. The call-and-response singing styles prevalent in African American spirituals echo similar traditions found in Native American ceremonies. Culinary staples like cornbread and gumbo reflect the fusion of African and Native culinary contributions, illustrating the deep interconnectedness of these cultures. In recent years, advancements in genetic testing and a renewed interest in genealogy have sparked a movement among African Americans to rediscover their Native ancestry. This awakening has led many to reconnect with tribal communities, learn indigenous traditions, and advocate for the recognition of shared histories. The story of mixed heritage challenges simplistic racial narratives, offering a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of identity. By embracing this complexity, we celebrate the resilience and adaptability of marginalized communities. These intertwined legacies remind us that the American experience is not defined by division, but by the blending of diverse cultures, traditions, and histories. The rise of mixed heritage among African Americans is not only a testament to survival, but also a call to honor the richness of connections that continue to shape who we are today. The history of African Americans is often framed as beginning with the transatlantic slave trade, but some scholars propose an even older connection, one that challenges traditional narratives and uncovers a far deeper and more intricate legacy. Evidence from historical records, oral traditions, and artifacts suggests that Africans may have reached the Americas long before Columbus's arrival in 1492. If true, this revelation reshapes how we understand African American and indigenous histories, highlighting their shared roots in exploration, innovation, and cultural exchange. One of the most compelling theories stems from the Mali Empire, a powerful West African kingdom that flourished during the 13th and 14th centuries. According to accounts by Arab historians like al-Umari, Emperor Mansa Abu Bakr II abdicated his throne in pursuit of exploration. In the early 14th century, he reportedly launched a fleet of ships across the Atlantic Ocean. While concrete evidence of these voyages remains elusive, many scholars believe they may have reached the Americas, leaving traces of African presence and influence. Artifacts and cultural parallels bolster this theory. The famous Olmec heads of Mesoamerica, for example, display distinctly African features, including broad noses and full lips, sparking debates about whether these sculptures reflect transatlantic contact. While mainstream archaeologists often attribute such similarities to independent development, proponents of the theory argue that these artifacts are evidence of an ancient African presence in the New World. Linguistic studies further support this possibility. Words and phrases in some Native American languages, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, show striking similarities to West African languages, suggesting a potential exchange of knowledge and culture long before European colonization. Additionally, agricultural techniques and tools used in the Americas bear a resemblance to those from Africa, hinting at shared practices and innovations. Oral histories from both African and indigenous communities also lend weight to these claims. In parts of Central and South America, legends speak of black-skinned people arriving by sea, bringing advanced knowledge of navigation and trade. Similarly, West African oral traditions recount stories of voyages across the Atlantic, suggesting a recognition of ancient encounters between these civilizations. Skeptics often argue that such parallels could result from independent innovation rather than direct contact. However, the sheer volume of overlapping evidence, from artifacts and language to oral traditions, challenges this notion and invites deeper exploration of these historical connections. Whether through deliberate exploration or accidental voyages, it is plausible that African travelers reached the Americas, leaving traces of their presence in the region's cultural and genetic fabric. If these theories are true, the implications for African American identity are profound. Such a connection establishes African Americans as inheritors of a legacy that predates the transatlantic slave trade, one rooted in exploration, ingenuity, and resilience. It also emphasizes the interconnectedness of global cultures, celebrating the shared human drive for discovery and exchange. Today, researchers and historians are delving deeper into these possibilities, meeting both fascination and controversy. This narrative is more than historical curiosity. It is a call to broaden our understanding of African American heritage. By embracing these ancient connections, we can celebrate the contributions of Africans to the Americas' history long before European conquest. This perspective not only enriches the story of African Americans, but also highlights the enduring ties between African and indigenous peoples, revealing a shared history of innovation, exploration, and resilience. In recent years, African Americans have embarked on a powerful journey of rediscovery, reclaiming their complex heritage and uncovering stories that reveal the deeply intertwined histories of African, Native American, and European ancestries. This process has not only reshaped individual identities, but also challenged the broader narratives that have long oversimplified the origins of African American communities. The advent of modern genetic testing has become a transformative tool in this rediscovery. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA have enabled African Americans to explore their genetic roots, often uncovering unexpected connections to Native American tribes, such as the Cherokee, Creek, or Seminole. These revelations challenge the singular focus on African lineage, highlighting the diverse and multifaceted histories that have shaped African American identities over centuries. For many, the discovery of native roots sparks a profound journey of cultural reconnection. This process goes beyond the scientific data, leading individuals to engage deeply with the tribal customs, languages, and histories that were erased or suppressed through generations of systemic marginalization. The stories of ancestors who navigated the harsh realities of colonization, slavery, and cultural assimilation are now being brought to light, revealing the resilience and adaptability of these interconnected communities. This movement is about more than ancestry. It's about reclaiming a legacy. It involves understanding the contributions and cultural wealth of ancestors whose stories were often silenced by colonial policies and societal norms. For instance, many African Americans are rediscovering traditional practices passed down through family lore, from culinary techniques like cornbread preparation, rooted in both African and Native traditions, to spiritual practices echoing Native ceremonies and African rituals. These revelations are not isolated events, but part of a broader awakening that empowers individuals and communities to redefine their place in history. By embracing the full complexity of their heritage, African Americans honor the strength of their ancestors who defied erasure and carried forward the fragments of their identities. This act of reclamation fosters a richer, more inclusive understanding of the American experience, celebrating the interconnectedness that has always been a part of its foundation. As these stories emerge, they not only reshape personal identities, but also strengthen bonds between African American and Native American communities. This shared history of survival and cultural blending reminds us of the importance of preserving and honoring the diverse legacies that make up our collective past. The journey of rediscovery is far from over, but with each step, it brings us closer to a fuller understanding of who we are and the profound connections that bind us together. Oral traditions remain a cornerstone in reclaiming and preserving heritage. Many African American families have passed down stories of Native American ancestry through generations, tales that survived systemic erasure and societal suppression. These narratives, shared by grandparents about ancestors who lived as Black Indians or had tribal affiliations hidden during times of racial segregation, are now being revisited with fresh eyes and greater appreciation. What was once dismissed as folklore or overshadowed by the dominant narrative of slavery is now being validated and celebrated as a vital part of history. Communities are working to revive the cultural practices of their Native and African ancestors, weaving these traditions into the modern fabric of African American identity. From culinary practices to spiritual ceremonies, this reclamation connects people not only to their roots, but also to sustainable and communal ways of living that resonate in today's world. For example, the rediscovery of indigenous farming techniques and herbal medicine practices has revitalized traditional knowledge, fostering a deeper connection to both ancestry and ecological stewardship. This reclamation, however, is not without its challenges. The deliberate erasure of Native American ancestry in African American history was a calculated act of colonial policies designed to simplify racial classifications and consolidate control. By labeling mixed heritage individuals as Black, colonial authorities sought to undermine indigenous sovereignty and reinforce a rigid racial hierarchy that supported the institution of slavery. This manipulation severed countless individuals from their full heritage, leaving behind barriers to understanding and reclaiming their identities. Addressing this erasure today requires not only personal exploration, but also collective action to challenge entrenched historical narratives. Grassroots movements have emerged as powerful forces in advocating for the recognition of Black Indians and mixed heritage individuals within Native American tribes. These efforts often focus on securing tribal membership for descendants who were excluded due to racial bias or outdated enrollment criteria. Such advocacy is not merely about legal recognition, but about restoring a sense of belonging and affirming the right to claim a shared history. Education plays a critical role in this process. Schools, museums, and cultural institutions are beginning to include the histories of African Native peoples in their curricula and exhibits. Documentaries, books, and social media platforms are amplifying these stories, making them accessible to broader audiences. This public awareness is essential for dismantling stereotypes and fostering a more nuanced understanding of the intertwined histories of African Americans and Native Americans. The reclamation of African American heritage is ultimately a testament to resilience. It honors the strength of ancestors who endured displacement, enslavement, and systemic erasure, yet preserved fragments of their identities through oral traditions, cultural practices, and community bonds. By piecing together these fragments, modern descendants not only honor their forebears, but also ensure their legacies endure for future generations. As we move forward, this process of rediscovery invites a profound question. How do we define identity in a world shaped by complex histories and shared experiences? The answer lies not in choosing one ancestry over another, but in embracing the full richness of all our roots. For African Americans who trace their lineage to both Africa and Native America, this journey is about rewriting the narrative of who they are, not just as descendants of oppression, but as inheritors of a legacy defined by survival, innovation, and cultural fusion. This journey of rediscovery is far from over. Each step, whether through personal exploration, community advocacy, or public education, brings us closer to a fuller understanding of the past. By embracing these interconnected stories, we pave the way for a future that celebrates the complexities of identity and the shared resilience of our ancestors.